Today, we're going to talk about one of the most massive, world-changing events of the 20th century, the partition of India. But we're not just going to look at it as a political decision. No, this is a human story, a story of division on a scale that's almost impossible to wrap your head around. And it all started with a simple line drawn on a map. To set the tone, let's just start with these words from the incredible poet Faz Amin Faiz. What's so powerful is that he wrote this on the actual morning of independence. It just perfectly captures the deep, deep heartbreak of a dream that came true at such a terrible cost, that the dawn of freedom itself felt wounded. This wasn't the morning they had all been fighting for. So, to really get how things went so wrong in 1947, you have to ask a much bigger question. Where did this whole idea of dividing people even come from? And for that, we have to rewind the clock way, way back to a time when Europe was starting to see itself and the world in a completely new way. It really all begins with this one idea: humanism. See, before the Renaissance, life for most people was just seen as prep for the afterlife. But then there's this huge shift. All of a sudden, the focus is on human achievement, human reason, what we can do right here on Earth. And that right there was a revolutionary spark. And this new thinking, it set off this incredible chain reaction. You can see it on the timeline here. The Renaissance kicks off new ideas. Then, the printing press spreads those ideas like wildfire. This new curiosity, mixed with a big dose of economic ambition, leads to the age of exploration. And where does that exploration lead? Well, it leads directly to imperialism, as all these European nations started competing to control the globe. One thing led to another, and pretty soon they're on shores all around the world, including India. And this global scramble for empire is exactly what casts this long, dark shadow over India. It really sets the stage for a conflict that was basically planted and then carefully watered for the next 200 years. Okay, so a huge turning point was the revolt of 1857. What's so amazing about this moment is you have this powerful display of Hindu-Muslim unity against the East India Company. And that unity, that idea of Indians coming together with a shared purpose, it absolutely terrified the British. They knew it was the single biggest threat to their rule. So, of course, that fear gave birth to a very deliberate, very calculated strategy. We've all heard the phrase, right? Divide and rule. Well, this wasn't just some clever saying. It became the actual cornerstone of British policy in India. It was a tool to make absolutely sure that a united front like the one they saw in 1857 could never, ever happen again. And this slide right here shows you the result perfectly. The British deliberately encouraged political parties to form along religious lines. So on one side, you've got the Indian National Congress, which at first was all about a unified India. But to balance them out, to counter their power, the British propped up the All India Muslim League, which started arguing that Hindus and Muslims were basically two different nations. They created the political divide they needed. And that whole divide and rule thing, it became official policy when they introduced separate electorates in 1909. I mean, think about how wild this is. It meant a Muslim could only vote for a Muslim candidate, a Hindu only for a Hindu. Religion was now literally written into the country's political DNA. From that point on, division wasn't just a tactic, it was the law. Okay, let's fast forward to 1947. Britain is completely broke and exhausted from World War II, and they are desperate to get out of India. That whole machine of division that they'd built and fine-tuned for decades, it was now a runaway train with no brakes. And the final act of the British Empire in India would be a story of pure chaotic haste. Which leads us to this, frankly, impossible question. How on earth do you carve up a massive subcontinent with centuries of shared culture, villages where people have lived side by side forever, in just 5 weeks? The simple answer is, you don't. You can't. But they gave the job to one man anyway, Sir Cyril Radcliffe. The facts about this are just staggering. The man they picked to draw the border of India and Pakistan had never even been to India. He knew nothing about the people, the land, the culture. They handed him outdated maps, bad census data, and a totally insane deadline. You know, he later refused his payment for the job, which tells you everything you need to know about how he felt about the catastrophic task he'd been given. And this insane rush, it was coming from the very top. Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy, basically saw the place as a ticking time bomb. His priority wasn't to be careful or just, it was to be fast. His motto was divide and quit. And that urgency, that need for speed, would have the most tragic consequences imaginable. Because while politicians and lawyers were drawing these lines on maps in quiet, air-conditioned rooms, Out on the ground, a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions was about to explode. This is the real story of partition. 10 million. Let that number just sink in for a second. In a span of just a few months, 10 million people were uprooted from their homes, forced to flee, becoming refugees in what had always been their own country. It is still the largest mass migration in all of human history. And then there's this number, 1 million. That's the estimated number of people who were killed in the brutal violence and massacres that erupted because of that one line on a map. One of the most horrifying symbols of this violence were the so-called ghost trains. Trains would be packed with refugees trying to get to the right side of the new border, and they'd be attacked along the way. They would pull into the station in total eerie silence, filled with the dead. And sometimes, chilling messages were scrawled on the side, a gruesome, taunting gift from one side to the other. But even in all that horror, there were these incredible glimmers of hope. In Punjab, a 55,000-strong army couldn't stop the killing. It was total chaos. But at the same time, in Calcutta, one man, Mahatma Gandhi, managed to stop the violence just by fasting and appealing directly to the people. Mountbatten himself called it the miracle of Calcutta, telling Gandhi he was a one-man boundary force. The violence did eventually subside, but the line drawn in haste on that map left permanent scars, not just on the people who lived through it, but on the geopolitics of the entire region, scars that are still very visible today. And here's a perfect example of how one seemingly small choice had massive, massive consequences. Take the decision to give the district of Gurdaspur, which had a Muslim majority, to India. That one move gave India its only real land route to the state of Kashmir. It is not an exaggeration to say that this single stroke of a pen laid the foundation for the conflict that has defined the relationship between India and Pakistan ever since. Which leaves us with this last thought. The story of partition is this brutal reminder that lines on a map are never, ever just lines. They're drawn by history, by politics, by ambition, by haste. But the price for them is always paid by ordinary people, in blood and tears, in ways that can echo for generations and generations to come.